Grasping does not apply only to the things you want. It also applies to the things you do not want. The mind can even cling to its own suffering. It can cling to worries, grievances, or the identity of someone who has been wronged or is deeply flawed. This is still grasping. It simply appears to be the opposite. A mind that is always grasping is always exhausted, because holding on requires continuous effort. You have to maintain the grip. You have to keep strengthening the story. You have to keep defending your position, and that process never truly ends. Because there is always something new to hold on to, always something to protect, always something to resist. Non-grasping does not mean indifference. This distinction is extremely important. You can care deeply about your life, relationships, work, and growth without closing your fist around the outcome. You can hold things the way you hold water in an open palm, present, attentive, but not squeezing. The Majjhima Nikaya contains many passages in which the Buddha describes the mind of someone who has loosened the grip of clinging. What he describes is not emptiness or apathy. He describes a kind of freedom while remaining fully engaged, doing everything wholeheartedly without becoming trapped by any of it. When you practice non-grasping in small moments throughout the day, something begins to accumulate. The mind that once spent enormous energy holding on slowly learns that it does not need to. And within that release, there is a kind of rest that even sleep cannot provide. This is the secret at the heart of no mind. It is not about forcing the mind to stop. It is about releasing your grip one thought at a time until only the open hand remains. And within that open hand, everything can rest. 8. Impermanence is not a sad truth. One of the most misunderstood teachings in Buddhism is the teaching of impermanence, anicca in Pali. Most people hear it as a sorrowful truth. Everything ends. Nothing lasts. It can sound like a beautiful kind of sadness, something we are expected to accept with a quiet sigh. But that is only the surface of what the teaching reveals. When you look more deeply, impermanence is not a source of sadness. It is a source of profound relief. Here is why. The thought troubling you right now will not last, not because you successfully suppress it, but because nothing lasts. Thoughts arise, they reach their peak, then they pass. This is not merely a coping strategy or a comforting idea. It is the observable nature of all mental experiences, described in detail in the Abhidhamma, the Buddhist analytical teachings that explain consciousness as a series of momentary arisings, each one distinct and each one disappearing almost as soon as it appears. What this means in daily life is extraordinary. You do not have to solve every difficult thought. You do not have to understand every problem your mind presents. You do not have to know why a certain feeling arrived or exactly when it will leave. You only need to notice that it is already moving, already changing, and already less solid than it appeared moments ago. The mind that clings to thoughts believes they are permanent realities. It treats a temporary mood as a permanent personality trait. It treats a moment of anxiety like a lifelong sentence. It treats one difficult day as proof of who you fundamentally are. Impermanence dissolves this belief, not through argument, but through direct observation. Sit long enough, and you will watch thoughts change. You will see emotions shift. You will realize that nothing the mind produces possesses the permanence it claims to have. And here is what becomes possible once you genuinely understand this. You stop trying to hold on to pleasant states and stop trying to force difficult states away. Both are forms of grasping. Both exhaust the mind. When you can observe both with the same steadiness, something extraordinary begins to open. The mind rests, not because everything has become pleasant, but because your relationship with what arises has changed. This is one of the deepest experiences of no mind available to an ordinary person living an ordinary life. You do not need to live in a monastery. You do not need to meditate for hours every day. You only need to carry this understanding into your ordinary moments, your commute, your kitchen, and your difficult conversations. Everything passes, including this, and within that passing, peace becomes possible. There is a quality that naturally appears as Buddhist practice deepens, and it is difficult to fully describe in Western language. But once you experience it, you recognize it immediately. It is the quality of doing something completely while remaining entirely at ease. Not the ease of someone who does not care, but the ease of someone who is no longer fighting the moment they are living. In Chan and early Zen-influenced Buddhist traditions, this is sometimes described as a natural and effortless way of being, acting in harmony with things as they are, instead of imposing how you believe they should be. This is not passivity. It is not surrendering. It is the complete opposite of forcing. Most people live in an almost constant inner argument with the present moment. This should be different. This should be easier. I should be further ahead. This situation should have unfolded another way. This argument becomes so constant and automatic that it no longer feels like an argument. It simply feels like normal thinking. But beneath the surface, it continuously exhausts the mind, using enormous energy to resist what is already here. The Dhammapada, one of the most widely studied texts in the Theravada tradition, begins with the observation that the mind is the forerunner of all actions. Whatever the mind repeatedly dwells upon shapes what follows. A mind that continually rests in resistance creates a life filled with friction. A mind that learns to meet the present without that internal argument creates something entirely different. In practical terms, this teaching appears in very small moments. You are washing the dishes and suddenly notice that your mind is somewhere else, planning, worrying, or rehearsing conversations. What would it mean to simply wash the dishes? Not as a meditation technique and not as a performance of mindfulness, but simply as a person who is here, now, doing this one thing. The mind that can remain fully present with an ordinary task without demanding that it become something else has found what many people search for in extraordinary experiences. No mind is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is the mind that washes the dish and finds that enough. The mind that sits within an ordinary moment without needing it to become different. And something remarkable happens when you stop demanding that each moment change. Those moments begin to feel richer, clearer, and more alive than you could have predicted. Not because the moments themselves changed, but because you stopped being somewhere else while they were happening. This is the art at the center of Buddhist practice, not achieving extraordinary states and not collecting endless insights. It is simply being where you are, doing what you are doing, without constantly placing the idea of what should be over the reality of what is. And when you finally meet what is directly, you may discover that it is already enough. 10. Returning home. Everything in this script has been pointing toward one thing, not a technique, not a philosophy, a return. The Buddhist understanding of the mind is not that it is fundamentally broken and must be repaired. It is that the true nature of the mind, what the Pali tradition calls citta in its undisturbed condition, is already luminous, already aware, and already capable of rest. The Anguttara Nikaya contains a passage in which the Buddha describes the mind as luminous but clouded by temporary defilements. The word temporary is important. It means those defilements are not part of the mind's essential nature. They arrived, which means they can also leave. The noise inside your head is not who you are. The worrying, replaying, and endless commentary are not your identity. They are weather, and you are not the weather. You are the open sky through which that weather moves. This truth has been discovered across thousands of years of Buddhist practice. In monasteries and forest hermitages, through lay practice and dedicated retreats, ordinary people have sat with their minds and discovered the same thing. Beneath the noise exists a quality of awareness that remains unshaken, that does not need anything to become different, and that is, in the oldest and simplest meaning of the word, at peace. You do not have to earn that peace. You do not have to think your way toward it. You do not need to silence every thought, resolve every doubt, or understand every teaching. You only need to begin. And beginning simply means noticing what is here right now, the sound of this voice, the rising of your breath, and the silence that remains even while the mind continues talking. That silence belongs to you. It has always belonged to you. This is the path Buddhism has preserved across centuries, not merely as a religion to believe, but as a practice to live. And living it begins exactly where you are, in this moment, in this breath, in this return to the stillness that never truly left. If something in these words reached you, you do not have to understand all of it immediately. Allow it to settle. A mind that is learning to rest does not need to grasp every insight the moment it appears. Return to these ideas. Sit with them. Practice them during the small and ordinary moments of your day. If this kind of content supports your journey, subscribing means more teachings like this can find their way to you. And if one of these lessons opened something within you, share it with someone who may need it. The silence you are searching for is not somewhere else. The Buddha once described the untrained mind as a fish pulled from water and thrown onto dry land, flopping, trembling, unable to be still. That image is 2,500 years old, and it describes exactly what it feels like to lie awake at 3 in the morning while your mind moves from one anxious thought to the next, without your permission. What's remarkable is that the same tradition that offered that observation also spent thousands of years developing an answer, not a suppression of thought, not a spiritual bypass around the difficulty of being human, but a genuine, practiced, tested understanding of how the mind works and what it needs to finally find rest. This is Mindfulness, and in this video we're going to explore 10 of those answers together, each one rooted in authentic Buddhist teaching, each one pointing toward what the tradition calls no mind. We'll cover why the mind talks constantly and what it's actually trying to do, why silence can feel threatening at first, what non-grasping really means in daily life, and how impermanence, understood deeply, becomes a source of relief rather than sadness. 10 secrets, 1 direction, rest 1. The burden you were never meant to carry. Most people walk through life believing they are responsible for every thought that enters their mind. If a dark thought appears, they feel ashamed. If a worried thought loops, they feel weak. If their mind races at 2 in the morning, they feel like something is wrong with them. But here's what the early Buddhist teachings actually say. The mind, by its very nature, produces thoughts the way the sky produces clouds, automatically, continuously, without your permission and without your control. The Pali Canon, one of the oldest surviving records of Buddhist teaching, describes the untrained mind as something that wanders. It uses the word citta, which refers to the heart mind, and describes its natural tendency to move, to seek, to grasp. This wasn't presented as a flaw, it was presented as a starting observation. This is what the mind does. Now, what will you do about it? The weight most people carry isn't the thoughts themselves. It's the belief that they are personally responsible for stopping them. That if they were calmer, wiser, more disciplined, the thoughts would go away. They won't, and they don't need to. What Buddhist practice offers isn't a silent mind. It offers a different relationship with the noise, one where you are no longer crushed by it. That shift alone is the beginning of real rest. 2. What no mind actually means. The term gets misunderstood constantly. People hear no mind and imagine a blank, empty, switched-off state, something close to sleep or numbness or the absence of thought entirely. That's not what it means. In Buddhist understanding, particularly within the traditions rooted in early Zen and Chan Buddhism, no mind refers to a mind that is not clinging, not a mind with nothing in it, but a mind that holds nothing too tightly, a mind that lets things pass through without grabbing onto them, without building stories around them, without turning a single thought into an entire identity. Think of a clear pool of water. When something falls into it, there's a ripple. That's natural, but the water doesn't chase the ripple. It doesn't replay the ripple. It doesn't worry about the next ripple. It simply returns to stillness because stillness is its nature. Your mind has that same nature. Underneath all the movement, underneath all the noise, there is a baseline of awareness that is already quiet, already still, already at rest. No mind isn't something you achieve by adding more techniques to your life. It's what remains when you stop fighting what's already there. The Buddhist path toward no mind isn't about becoming something new. It's about recognizing what you've always been beneath the noise. 3. The thinking trap. There is a particular habit the untrained mind falls into that Buddhism identified long before modern psychology had a name for it. The habit of treating every thought as something that requires a response. A thought appears, and instead of letting it pass, the mind grabs it, examines it, argues with it, follows it down a corridor of related thoughts, and suddenly you're not here anymore. You're lost in a story that began with a single automatic thought you didn't even choose to have. The Buddhist term for this is papancha. It refers to the proliferation of thought, the way the mind takes a simple perception and expands it into an elaborate construction. One observation becomes a judgment. One judgment becomes a narrative. One narrative becomes a belief about yourself or the world. The Buddha spoke about papancha in the Madhupindika Sutta, describing how sense contact leads to perception, perception leads to thought, and thought, when the mind is untrained, leads to this uncontrolled proliferation that pulls a person further and further from direct experience. And here's what makes it a trap. The mind that's caught in papancha believes it's solving something. It feels productive. It feels necessary. But most of the time, it's just spinning, creating complexity where there was only a simple moment. Noticing this trap is the beginning of stepping out of it. 4. Breath as the bridge. Every major school of Buddhism, regardless of tradition, language, or cultural background, returns to one practice: watching the breath. This isn't coincidence. It isn't simplicity for beginners. There is a specific reason breath sits at the center of Buddhist mind training, and understanding that reason changes the way you practice it. The breath is the one thing in your experience that is simultaneously automatic and available to conscious attention. You don't have to control it. It breathes whether you watch it or not. But the moment you place your attention on it, you are here, in this body, in this moment, not in yesterday's conversation or tomorrow's to-do list. This is what the Anapanasati Sutta, the discourse on mindfulness of breathing, describes in detail. The Buddha taught that by simply attending to the breath, the mind begins to settle. Not by force, not by concentration as effort, but by the natural settling that happens when attention stops wandering and rests on something real. The breath is always now. You cannot breathe tomorrow's breath. You cannot hold yesterday's. There is only this one, arriving and leaving, arriving and leaving. Every time you return to it after the mind has wandered, something subtle is trained, the muscle of returning. And that muscle is exactly what no mind requires. 5. The watcher who was always there. Here is something you may have never been told directly. In Buddhist understanding, there is a dimension of your mind that has never been disturbed. Not by your worst day, not by your loudest thoughts, not by any of the storms you've lived through. It is sometimes referred to as awareness itself. Not the awareness of something, just the bare capacity to know, to notice, to be present. This isn't a mystical claim. It's an observation you can verify right now. Right now there are thoughts in your mind, perhaps reactions to what you're hearing, doubts, agreements, wonderings. Notice that you are aware of them. That awareness, the part that notices the thoughts, is not the same as the thoughts themselves. The Pali tradition uses the word sampajanya to refer to this quality of clear comprehension, a knowing that is present and undisturbed even while things are happening. It's not detachment in the sense of not caring. It's more like the space in which everything occurs, which is itself untouched by what occurs within it. When you begin to recognize this watcher, this quiet awareness underneath the noise, something stabilizes. You still have difficult thoughts, you still feel emotions, but there is now a place in you that isn't knocked over by them. That place was always there, you just hadn't been introduced yet. 6. Why silence feels uncomfortable. If stillness is our natural state, why does it feel so uncomfortable when we first try to sit quietly? This is one of the most honest questions a person can ask, and Buddhism answers it directly. The Pali word dukkha is often translated as suffering, but a more precise translation is unease or unsatisfactoriness. The Buddha's first teaching described dukkha as a fundamental characteristic of ordinary experience, and one of its expressions is this: the mind conditioned to constant stimulation finds stillness not peaceful but threatening, because in the silence, what's been avoided starts to surface. The grief that was kept busy, the anxiety that was managed with distraction, the questions that were never allowed to settle. When the noise stops, these things rise. Most people interpret this as proof that stillness is dangerous. It's actually proof that it's working. Buddhism doesn't teach that we should avoid what surfaces in silence. It teaches that the practice of sitting with discomfort, without running from it, and without drowning in it, is itself the training. The Salatha Sutta describes two kinds of pain: the original sensation and the suffering we add to it through reaction. One is unavoidable, the other is where practice lives. The discomfort of silence isn't the enemy of rest, it's the doorway into it. Every time you remain with discomfort for just a little longer, the doorway opens wider. 7. The secret of non-grasping. There is a teaching in Buddhism that sounds simple until you sit with it long enough to understand how completely it can transform everything. It is the teaching of upadana, which means clinging or grasping. The Buddha identified clinging as one of the central causes of mental suffering. Not the circumstances of your life, not what happens to you, but the way the mind wraps itself around things and refuses to release them. And here is what is rarely explained clearly. It is already here, waiting beneath the noise, as patient as the breath itself.